few seconds to get that going. Okay, so we're now welcoming our global audience to join us here at the Getty Museum as well for our program this evening. My name is Peter Tchaikovsky still, and I organize the speaker series here at the Getty Museum, and we're very happy to welcome you here. This program is the result of a long conversation we've been having here at the Getty. Our manuscripts curators, particularly Bryan Keene, who will be speaking to you in a moment, came to me and said, let's do a program on Game of Thrones. I first said, what's that? And then we went from there. That was about 2 years ago. We had a perfect exhibition for the program. The exhibition was on chivalry. And, well, we looked into it and we found out, well, they're actually kind of busy, the people making Game of Thrones. So it's taken us about 2 years, and then one day our friend and partner at UCLA, Deborah Landis, who you will meet shortly, called me up and said, I have this amazing costume designer named Michele Clapton coming to UCLA for an artist in residence, and she did all the work for 5 seasons at Game of Thrones. Do you want her? And I said, yes, and anytime, I don't care when. And as it turns out, the timing was perfect because we have our exhibition Traversing the Globe Through Medieval Manuscripts, curated by Bryan Keene, who will be speaking momentarily. And Bryan in this show, many of you have seen it, I know, breaks down the idea that the Middle Ages was simply a European phenomenon. He shows us what was happening through manuscripts around the world during the period that we call the Middle Ages. So if you haven't seen that yet, I hope you will take an opportunity to see it before the exhibition closes. The program will run as follows. Bryan will come up and introduce the work he's been doing related to medieval manuscripts as well as Game of Thrones. And then he'll be followed by Deborah Landis, who will introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Michele Clapton. Then they'll, in the time remaining, they'll take center stage. They'll have a little conversation among themselves, and then we're going to invite you to submit your questions as well. When they take center stage, there will be ushers in the aisles passing out note cards. We would like to receive questions, written questions, on those note cards. So if you have a question, raise your hand, make sure an usher finds you, and then send the card back to the aisle, and we'll get them up on stage for them. And we also invite you to submit your questions to us via Twitter. We've got 2 hashtags for tonight. One of our hashtags is always the hashtag for programs here. It's hashtag Getty Talks. For tonight, we also have hashtag Designing GOT. So I'm going to introduce both Bryan and Deborah, so they'll come up sequentially, and then Deborah will introduce Michele. Bryan Keene, as I've mentioned, is an assistant curator here at the Getty Museum in the Department of Manuscripts, and he is also currently completing his doctorate at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. He's been the curator of many exhibitions for us, including the current exhibition, and he's also an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University. Many of you may know his work, however, through his presence through social media, and for a few seasons now, he's been connecting the Game of Thrones plots to manuscripts in the Getty Museum's collection, and you can find that on the Getty Iris, which is the Getty blog, which you can find at getty.edu, as well as on the Getty's Tumblr page. Following Bryan, Deborah Landis will come up. Deborah is a costume designer and costume historian who studied at UCLA and received a PhD from the Royal College of Art, which is also in London. I don't think they met each other there. Her film credits as costume designer include American Werewolf in London, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Coming to America, and Animal House. Now, we've been partnering with Deborah for a few years now, and she brings us these amazing costume designers to speak on topics related to the Getty Museum. And I always like to say when I introduce her that the Getty Museum is not only here at the Getty Center, but we have the Getty Villa, where we have Greek and Roman antiquities. And so we are always happy to welcome anyone who does interesting work with togas. She's also a curator who organized the much celebrated and much visited Hollywood costume exhibition, which opened at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and then was next door to LACMA for a long time and many other locations. And she is also currently the director of the David C. Copley Center for Costume Design at UCLA. So please welcome first Bryan Keene.
Good evening, welcome, thank you, Peter, and for those who know, may the 4th be with you. Excellent, that's great. It is my great pleasure to welcome you again here to the Getty Center this evening, and I'm so enthused to see so many people who have visited our manuscripts exhibitions, and I'm more especially excited to be talking about dress and costume in HBO's Game of Thrones. For those of you who don't know, that's based on George R.R. Martin's saga A Song of Fire and Ice, which has been adapted by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss for HBO. So now we're on the same page. Helping us a little bit further along, illuminated manuscripts are books written and painted entirely by hand, often embellished with brilliant colors and metallic leaf. These precious objects allow us to glimpse the beliefs, the social hierarchies, the architecture, and certainly the fashions that were popular in the pre-modern world. Here we witness the imposing specter of death, sort of like a white walker, above the mutilated bodies of 3 finely dressed individuals. The sole survivor is a young woman we know named Denise Ponchet. She kneels in a dress of couleur changeante, crimson and gold. Her hair is covered to show that she is a married woman. And she holds a single object, a manuscript, which is probably a prayer book, and it gives us one view into how one would have prepared him or herself for death's call in the Middle Ages. Death, after all, comes for all of us, a poignant, if macabre, theme that is all too real in the Game of Thrones. And there are, of course, many of these modern medievalisms in the Game of Thrones, despite the fact that the show is clearly a fantasy for those who don't know. We get emails constantly about how real is the Game of Thrones. But we are sucked into the gritty realism of this dystopian world precisely because of the costumes, the setting, the character arcs, etc. After all, this show is in fact filmed in various locations in which the architectural fabric of the Middle Ages can still be experienced today, Croatia and Spain, respectively. So as Peter mentioned, starting in season 4, our social media team, Annalisa Steffen and Sarah Waldorf, suggested that we pair medieval art with the Game of Thrones and to recap each episode with medieval art. And those that have seen the newest season, you're seeing a few, hopefully spoiler-free, but provocative images nonetheless. We followed these with blog posts attempting to shed more light onto these medievalisms, suggesting readings for various characters in the Game of Thrones, like a fencing manuscript for Arya, or a book on monstrous creatures for Daenerys Targaryen. And so we did then post historically accurate themes from the Game of Thrones, like violence. And we love being able to bring out our bloody, brutal images to show you that the Middle Ages were actually very bad. As Doctor Who said, the Middle Ages was not a good time to be alive. We also highlight nudity. There's a lot of great nudity in our collection, and it allowed us to focus somewhat on the undergarments of various figures. Saint Sebastian, for example, at right, gives us a glimpse into the briefs, the tighty-whities of the Middle Ages. But more seriously, to think about color symbolism, the color blue being one of the most significant colors, and we'll be hearing about blue tonight again. And you can see how just changing the hue of the blue on the Virgin Mary can give a very different meaning and emotion. The 7 Sorrows of the Virgin at right that you'll be able to see in our galleries up close this summer. And of course, the entire manuscripts department got on board with me and our film specialist, Christopher Sprinkle, to reimagining the opening credits of Game of Thrones using our manuscripts collection and the study room. And I encourage you all to watch, share, and like this video on YouTube. Please do it. This is one great detail of our magnifying glass really zooming in there. But this season, I'm excited to be joined by another member of our curatorial staff, Alexandra Kaczynski, who's here tonight, who's helping me to explore the global themes in the Game of Thrones, which Michele will talk to us a little bit about as well. The exhibition remains on view until the end of June. But to also think about our newest acquisition, the Book of the Deeds of Jacques de Lalande, a biographical account of the most famous tournament fighter of the very late Middle Ages. The exhibition that's on view charts an ambitious course around the world and across history and finds links, for example, from the silver mines in Peru that were being sent objects to the courts of Europe, the papal and the imperial courts, who then sent precious objects to the Shah of Persia in exchange for silk woven by Armenian merchants from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it is a kaleidoscopic journey much akin to the continual refocusing on geography that we see in the Game of Thrones credits. So you do have to constantly refocus. But we also highlight the various Christian communities that existed throughout the medieval world, like Ethiopia and Armenia, to focus on the relationship between book arts and cultures in contact. It truly presents an idea of the mashup of the Middle Ages, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, etc., living, existing, communicating alongside each other, and seeing these influences in the book arts. So in the last few moments, drawing from the titles of George R.R. Martin's novels, I'd like to make a few comments about medieval fashion. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you lose, you live or you die. These famous words from the book and the series were expressed in the Middle Ages in a different way. Fortune waits for all of us at the gallows, as we ourselves tend the gallows and wait for death. Here, fortune spins the wheel, and we see the rise and fall of kings, courtiers, peasants, etc. All can rise to the top in this medieval view. Medieval Christians and people living in Europe inherited the traditions of the Judeo-Christian world and the classical past, and we can see that influence through the togas, as Peter's already mentioned at left, Christ and his followers, and in the sort of contemporary and yet somewhat exotic costume for Alexander the Great at right, imagined, though, as a contemporary 15th century elite court setting. But local patrons also allow us to see a global narrative of the Middle Ages. For example, Charles the Bold, kneeling at left with his patron saints, commissioned a number of objects worn in silk, from Persia, and we see that the artist Lieven van Latham has evoked this stamped silk at right in the border of the manuscripts, and we'll talk a little bit about stamped silk later this evening. Breaking the ever-turning wheel of fortune, though, often called for a clash of kings. The Valois house that we see here was one of the great ruling dynasties in medieval Europe, and in this stunning illumination, Louis, the 12th of his name, as it says down below, you can see how very Game of Thrones this is, kneels accompanied by a series of patron saints and ancestors. The warrior Archangel Michael at left, clad in golden armor. Charlemagne, Saint Louis, and Saint Denis, gold their crowns, gold their shrouds. Louis and his heirs inherited a fragmented Europe and kingdoms that were at war with other principalities, with the empire and the papal states. These many portraits from the Getty collection reveal these various players in the Game of Thrones: a pope, a king, a general, a boy soldier, a merchant, a court lady, a rider, and a married woman. But a closer look at their dress and accessories reveals much about their status and positions. The rings of mourning, the chivalric collars, the taffeta shirt slightly untied, the beautiful brooch and symbol of pilgrimage, the headdresses of the women suggesting married or unmarried states, and in the beautiful quartered garment in our newest acquisition. These many warring states, of course, produced a storm of swords across the world. Armor has become iconic when we think about the Middle Ages, and I'm very happy to hear more about Game of Thrones armor tonight. In fact, armor was not just worn in war in the Middle Ages, but could be worn in tournaments, as we see here, a sort of Tyrion Lannister-like tournament armor, because of that. But also, there were handbooks for how to fight and how to overcome one's enemies. For example, how you would overcome an enemy with holding a single longsword when your enemies came at you with long, short, and sticks. The way to vanquish any enemy is, in this image, to be cunning like a lynx, swift like a tiger, strong like an elephant, and fiery like a lion, and to look death in the face and say, "Not today." This constant fighting led to many a feast for crows. Here we see a beautiful image of a range of social classes. The king who is successful with his fur-lined garment, mutilating the body of another king who has left us with his beautiful undergarments, the dagged hood of our butcher, and then the beautiful colors of the peasants' wear. Death comes for us all, as we've said, and funerary armor and funerary garments, actually, called for somber processions that were choreographed with a range of social hierarchies, with professional mourners, as we see in the upper right image, and clerics dressed in all manner of somber, dark attire. But also life had to be celebrated in the Middle Ages. One of the great moments, of course, being weddings, not wearing white, but wearing crimson. This is a very tame wedding scene, not like the red wedding or the purple weddings. But the Middle Ages also focused on fantastic costumes, like in this Dance with Dragons. In the Middle Ages, to evoke distant lands, one could turn to dress, as in this costume show of the three kings who brought gifts to the Christ child. We can see the European king is dressed in cloth of gold silk. The Asian king is dressed as the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor. And the African king is dressed with the turban of the Mamluks of North Africa. In this Persian image on view in the exhibition, you see Alexander the Great, now dressed as the Emperor of China, while he's visiting the most sacred site for Muslims, the Kaaba in Mecca, this beautiful mashup and pastiche of costume, dress, place, and time. And so as we await the next book in the series, and as the winds of winter dissipate here in Los Angeles, just a final look at some of the greatest fashions from the Middle Ages. Knights and ladies with a beautiful red chaperon and feathered armor, the dress with embroidery by Our Lady here. Truly look at all of menswear. We know that Michele Clapton likes hats, and I want to talk a little bit about hats and headgear tonight. This beautiful lineup of women, the hennin, the pointed hats of the Middle Ages. This really does show you all manner of female dress. But you go to church often in the Middle Ages to see color or to see beautiful displays of costume, as our former head of the manuscripts department used to say. From the very drab Banana Republic, undyed and unbleached garments of the Franciscans to the very ostentatious dyed and bleached garments of the Dominicans, of the pointed star, the Benedictines, or the Cistercians. And then looking at medieval calendars, you see all ranges and classes of society, but cast really for the noble patrons who are looking at these books. We don't want to look at ugly peasants, after all, even when they're sweating in the fields in nothing but a tunic. And at times, we see coats of arms and sigils woven into the garments, probably fantastically. But here, one of my favorite images in the entire collection that I think evokes the spirit of the Game of Thrones in the Middle Ages is a portrait of a knight called Simon de Vary. We know his name because his motto, Vie à mon désir, life, according to my desire, is an anagram that unscrambled spells Simon de Vary. But we have to remember, above all, the people who created the outfits, the looks that have endured across time, the guildsmen and women who worked in leather, wool, silk, created pattern books, and especially the Shoemakers Guild. That we have this beautiful page in the Getty collection that produced the enduring looks that we still love in the present, even if seen through the lens of fantasy literature and a television sensation. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Landis to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I really like the sherbet between the courses. So I'm here to recalibrate all of you and make the transition between the real, or the real-ish, and entertainment, or the telling of stories. The first thing I have to do, though, is I have to thank Peter Tchaikovsky and the Getty for hosting us this evening, for Bryan Keene for being so generous. Also, mostly Swarovski. Michele Clapton is our Swarovski 2016 Swarovski designer in residence, so we have to thank Swarovski for bringing her to Los Angeles. The David C. Copley Center was founded at UCLA, was founded to support the practice and the scholarship in the field of costume design. And it's the first of its kind anywhere. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about costume design and what costume design is meant to be. And that might be a little bit different from what you think it is. No matter what era the story takes place, the audience is asked to believe that the people in the story are real and they have had a life before the series began. We join our cast of characters at one moment in their life. Everything about them must ring true, including their clothing. The people are the emotional core of every story, and it's their journey that moves us. It's the people, the characters in the stories, who hold our attention and who are of endless fascination to the audience. That's us. Costume designers practice a discrete and formal design process that begins with the written word, discussion with the writers and producers and the director, and then collaboration with the actor. For each production, costume designers compile research and their inspiration, which may include photos, historic text, artwork, textiles, family albums, home movies, not in this case, hair and makeup styles, fabric swatches, and virtually any and every visual reference that they can acquire. Nothing that appears in the frame is casual or accidental. Every single accessory has a role, and each costume is a deliberate choice made by the designer. Costumes are so much more than clothes. Costumes embody the psychological, social, and emotional condition of each character at a particular moment in the script. When a character and a story, like Game of Thrones, captures the public's imagination, the costumes can ignite worldwide fashion trends and become embedded in popular culture. Cinematic icons are born when we fall deeply in love with the people in the story. And that's what costume design is all about. It's about a relationship that we have with the story and the people who live it. Let me tell you a little bit about Michele Clapton. Michele Clapton, our 2016 Swarovski designer in residence, studied fashion and worked as a designer for a number of years, and later moved into a fashion designer for a number of years, and then she moved into styling music videos and commercials before embarking on a career in costume design. While continuing to design many other projects, including films and dance, for the past 6 years, Michele has been the Emmy Award-winning designer responsible for HBO's wildly popular The Game of Thrones. She will shortly start to design Game of Thrones Series 7, having been asked to return last season to design episodes 9 and 10. Michele has also just designed The Crown, a huge Netflix series about the 25-year-old newlywed Queen Elizabeth II. And that show will premiere on Netflix, write it down, November 4th, 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Michele Clapton.
Okay, so just go back one. Stuck in. So here we are, Game of Thrones. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to try and give you a very short insight into the costume designing process of Game of Thrones. Unlike historical pieces that usually give you a ready-made world to research, fantasy allows you to create this for yourself. But here lies a great danger. You cannot move forward successfully without structure. It is essential that there are clearly defined societies based on their localized resources, climate, society, and hierarchy. We have such a short time in which to prepare. Usually have 2 weeks private prep time per season, followed by 10 weeks prep with my crew. This is my London studio where I start. It's a visual interpretation of how I think and design. It's stuffed full of ideas and books collected over my life. It's very chaotic, as you can see. David Benioff came to visit when I first got the job, and we talked through the costume direction. We discussed George R.R. Martin's books and how true to be to them. David was pretty clear even then that we should take our own path. For a period piece, I will immerse myself in the given time. On Game of Thrones, I collected like a magpie. I looked at Japanese armor, medieval, Flemish, Renaissance, Byzantine, Rome, and Greek. I looked at people living in extreme conditions, the Inuit, nomadic tribes. I looked at folk culture, tribal mythology, religious garb. I collected imagery at museums, online, books, anywhere. I didn't need to know where it came from. On this project, it was best not to know. I needed it to be eclectic for me to be able to create new. If I pursued one direction, then that would become dominant. As I explained in my first statement, the real key into the series was the geography and climate provided by the books, and then the related crafts and trades in line with each area. As I move forward, I'd start to collate my eclectic images and assimilate them onto mood boards as a visual starting point for each area. I look at all areas, even those that we won't visit maybe for some time and to later seasons, just to get a balance. The language of medieval and Renaissance costume would actually inspire ideas as to how to show status, give emotional messages within the costumes. I'm going to start with the Night's Watch. Once David and Dan have approved, I will use these boards to communicate with my crew and other departments. My relationship with the production designers, Gemma Jackson and later Deborah Riley, are of prime importance. They will have already had access to David and Dan, as they start prep so much earlier than I do. My characters had to inhabit their sets, so we must work together for the world to be believable. This relationship is really key. So what follows are a few of my many images and many boards, starting here with the Night's Watch. A few weeks before I heard about Game of Thrones, I was actually in LA, in Santa Monica, and I came across this amazing book. It's a contemporary Norwegian painter called Ode Nerdrum. And when I later read the script, it seemed so relevant to the Night's Watch. It evoked this feeling of loneliness, isolation, yet also indicated a brotherhood formed out of circumstance. I showed Gemma on our first meeting, and she experienced the same emotions. It also showed a terror and at times a desperation, emotions I imagined experienced by the unwilling recruits, isolated from their families and from previous lives. It also the lost souls that spoke to me, Samuel Tarly being a prime example. I tried to imagine the skills that they might have they would have to be self-sufficient. They could add plate to existing leather for protection. They could also quilt donated garments together, trapping wool between the layers for warmth. I started drawing just to help define the recruits from different backgrounds. Once an honorable profession for the second or third son, but now much more likely to be a thief, a rapist, or a misunderstood son. Actually, some of these drawings, sometimes I started with the guy on the right, and then he actually sort of morphed into the hill tribe. So actually, when you start drawing, then you sort of find different areas for people. I'm sadly not allowed to show you fitting photos. It's a shame, as they give such an insight into the process of design and how they help the actor find their character. For instance, here, the way the weight affected his gait. These capes are actually IKEA rugs. We cut and... Bit of a trick. I know we take anything we can. We cut and we shaved them, and then we added strong leather straps and then breakdown, which is like a religion on Game of Thrones. I want the audience to almost smell the costumes. Here they were waxed and frosted so that they belonged to the landscape. And then I had talked to David and Dan and Gemma about how we could practically show the dyeing of the clothes black. We loved the idea of a huge cauldron in Castle Black Courtyard with donating clothes being tossed in. And as the dye runs thin before more pigment is added, it will naturally create a variation in shade. David and Dan are really interested in these practical solutions such as this. It makes it more real and we understand the process. And here, just for a moment, we see that Samuel Tarly knew that he was coming here, so he's got a padded costume on because he knew it was going to be cold. The guy next to him has a little thin shirt. He was taken from his King's Landing, obviously a thief. I don't think he was a rapist. I think he was a thief. He was a nice guy. So we moved to Winterfell. The Winterfell actually was obviously the main setting in the pilot, so it seemed a really good place to start from. When I first joined, Gemma had been on for a while, so I arrived and saw these lovely concept boards. And I was so happy to find, because they underpinned the direction I had been moving in. It sort of had a medieval, but with a hint of an Eastern influence. It was always important to have this sort of melange of ideas. I start pulling images from my boards, and I use these images to inspire direction. From the books, we know the Starks worship the old gods, found in natural objects. The climate is cold, not much trading, so they have to be self-sufficient. There's probably one of each trade, so there's no competition, so styles haven't changed over the years. I looked at folkloric images, I looked at weaving willow and tools and how they might work. I looked at lichen and into the possible use of dyeing, also to inspiration for embroidery and print. I looked at natural forms of decoration. I found this wonderful wood necklace in the British Museum. And I looked at felting techniques. And then this piece actually became the inspiration for the segmentation of Ned's armor. I researched protection here from the eastern Siberia, and I began to realize that silhouette would be really important to help us place ourselves. And I explored organic textures. I sometimes look at contemporary pieces. It doesn't matter what it is, it's just what it makes you think. I looked at practical shapes of costume and armor, but I decided I really didn't want metal because of the cold climate. I didn't want it to be able to conduct the cold. So then I looked at English plate armor, and the metal encase says not to conduct the cold, which was really useful. I looked at Russian padded armor. And then coming back to silhouette, I just looked at some Japanese pieces here, and then a contemporary piece by Hussein Chalayan. I think sometimes looking at contemporary just shifts your idea a bit. I then looked at sort of textures and the ideas of beauty and accessories and applique and sigil ideas, also ways to show character and tell stories, the cut of costume and the proportion. And then moving on, I started looking at available materials. They would have had wool, leather, and fur. I decided actually really early on to use loom state fabrics, which I would dye ourselves so as to have complete control over the color palette. From these color pieces, we would actually create a color Bible for each place. Color is really my passion. It can tell you so much about a character, his standing, the mood, his allegiance. I really wanted the dominant color for Stark to be blue, a warm gray blue, to help define them as the most important family in the north. I researched into natural dyes and found that the dogwood tree, which actually is known for its hard wood and straight branches, so it's used as arrows, but the bark of it would actually create a blue dye. So it seems a really practical way of doing that, and then we would use lichen to give the shading. I then turned my attention to crafts that they might actually have skills for, weaving, felting, leatherwork, embroidery, sewing, and looked at the work of Andy Goldsworthy and Anish Kapoor, which inspired the connection to nature and the organic shapes. So slowly I was beginning to sort of find a direction, and finally I started sketching to find a way in. I now have to assimilate all these ideas into a look that I think expresses the life of the group of people in their particular circumstances. I always do my own drawing, even though I'm not a particularly good illustrator, but it enables my thought process. So taking into consideration the local habitat, climate, and ideas of protection, silhouette, and craft, I start to work with my craft breakdown team to try out these color ideas. They become individual, characterful, and we have fun, and we've finally started. I would continue to draw ideas and start to share them with David and Dan. Unlike film, I only work with David and Dan, the writers, to create the looks, not the directors. It's too complicated with 4 or 5 directors each season. It starts pulling in too many different ways, so it's much better to just work with the writers. And here I start to think of how narrow the cloth might be if it's made on simple household looms. I do double drawstring collars so that I can pad within the collars if it's cold. And we start looking at applique and fastenings. This was old Nan. She was a wonderful woman, and a servant's costume next to her. It was a really frugal existence, obviously, but the organic darning here gives a sense of the nature expressing their connection to the environment and beliefs. It relates to the embroidery on the actually High family as neck pads, which we'll see later. The High family don't set the style in King's Landing, I decided. It's much more symbiotic here. And I start to explore the textures on the right of the sort of try to do a bark weave that will again link it to the environment. These are really early drawings of Catelyn Stark. I wanted practical layers with fur lining and simple cloths of wool. And this is the first sketching of the men, just to get the proportions, concentrating on the silhouette, the quilting, and the leather and fur. I fitted the girls together because they were both really young, and actually neither of them had any acting experience. But here's an example of how I tried to weave messages into clothes. With the knots, I wanted them to represent that the girls were prepubescent. We then note Sansa's surprise when Cersei asks her if she has bled, when it's for all to see that she's still a child by wearing her knots. I thought these knots were playful and represented childhood. I then added little embroideries on each to signify a task completed or a skill learned. My job as a costume designer is to aid the storytelling. The palette and the fabrics we see here in King's Landing help in defining the characters. Note Sansa has hidden her knots as she wants to appear a grown-up here. And then we see Arya arrive in a helmet, which Ned confiscates. This all helps to inform the viewer as to her character and their relationship. Just returning to the neck pads. The embroidered neck pads worn by the High family show status, and the embroidery tells stories with sigils intertwined. Caitlin chooses her coat, closes her coats with fibrillae decorated with the family sigil of fish. We have no buttons, actually, in King's Landing, just fibrillae and lacing. Caitlin's cloak here, she's the only wearer of the patterned brocade cloth in Winterfell, a gift probably from her family. Cat is not as ostentatious, so we will then dye it to say sympathetic the colours of Winterfell with slight reference to River Run. And here we see Ned, brutal but fair, a certain grimness, world-weary and holding many secrets. The boys' clothing is the same style but cut, but John's is in cloth and Rob's is in leather, showing status. Bran has detachable sleeves, a symbol of childhood, easier to remove and launder dirty sleeves than the whole costume. Here you see how breakdown is so important. It actually makes you really believe that people live in this place. The outsiders, Thea and John, can only wear rabbit fur of a lower status. Theon's pretentious arrogance hides the lost boy. Decorative details on his doublet show illusions of misplaced grandeur, the antithesis of Ned's style. But John, more serious, moody, and introspective. We get this from the costumes without the need for words. Just moving to the maesters for a moment, an order of scholars, healers, and learned men present in each house. I love this John Van Eyck wrap. It just did the way, I didn't use it obviously as a head wrap, but it's just the weight of the fabric and how beautifully it wrapped. So then I started sketching. As one of their responsibilities in communicating, they used ravens. In early drawings based on the Stark collars, I created a basket headpiece lined with a rabbit, but sadly this film was the scene was never filmed. I know, I really loved it. I wore it a bit, actually. I just cold in Belfast. I tried to inhabit their life and try to imagine how the costumes would feel and not what they would feel, what they would need from them. I often work on the stand with costumes like this. As we work, we find what we need. We needed to anchor this with an underyoke for support. It has a long collar that could wrap up around the head to keep warm, and they have an underrobe of linen. The maester's chains they gain at the citadel, each link which they make themselves represents a different skill learned. I wanted a certain scale and weight to this, a brutality, yet some detailed decoration to indicate the levels of learning within each subject. So that was a nice rough look at Winterfell. This show is huge and demanding. Every morning I walk for an hour early before I go to work. It's my only time alone to think and to try to solve problems. I also collect feathers for costumes as I go. I never stop. Actually, now even when I walk and I'm not even doing the job, I still collect feathers as I walk along. So to King's Landing, it's the antithesis of Winterfell. I love the paintings of Gustave Moreau. I love the layering and the colours and the patterning within it. You always tend to go back to familiar places. I throw my net wide in the short time I have. Here I look at medieval fabrics for print references and ideas for sigils. More print references from the Renaissance and the medieval. And then we see it translated into Joffrey's costume and actually Cersei's embroidery. I want the crowns and jewelry I designed to give messages. With Cersei, when she designs the hand for Jaime, I wanted it to be beautiful. And we spent a long time trying to work out how it should look, and I wanted it to look like a caress, but also to be able to hold a sword. We actually made it, we actually took a mold of his hand, we then made it in iron, we then hammered brass onto that and decorated it. And then we made a little tiny opening which he could just about squeeze his real hand into. I think it's quite claustrophobic. And here we have an example of Joffrey's Baratheon crown with antlers worn at an angle, which informed us so clearly as to his character. And later how the Tyrrell Rose strangles it at the purple wedding. See the hand of the king. I wanted the idea that the hand reaching through to point the way, to guide. Not the hand of the king. Yeah, the hand of the king, yeah. And then sometimes I do use concept drawings. If I have a particularly complicated armor, I have to design like the Knight of the Rose. It makes it clearer for the armorer to be able to see what I actually want him to do. I then go to costume houses and pull rails of costumes which will complement it and get an idea of the sort of scale and the range of fabrics I'll need. I start to explore the color palette for the King's Landing. I visit costume houses again just to pull shapes and colors together. You see on the left here. I start to think about the Lannister armor, and I start to look at the Italian Renaissance armor for decorative reference, but then combine it with a bit of Japanese influence as well. I love the opening, the way the helmet's opened. I looked at panels of colors and how we could actually make the skirts. But then when I came to draw it, it was far too Japanese still, so it took a long time to... Armor for me was the hardest because it's something I hadn't really designed before, so I worked very closely with my armorer. But the early drawings finally led to somewhere which was somewhere between the two, a hybrid, and we made our first sample. The headdress was actually too heavy for this, although it's supposed to be an officer, so later we lost that. I actually just want to show you that I do make helmets for everyone, even if you never see them wear them. This is the process of making Tywin's helmet. We make it in card, and then we move to metal, and we try and experiment with patination and decoration. Finally, we come to it, and this was the finished result. We see the detailing in the armor, so you see the lion, which is very Renaissance, and then you see it's brass on leather, and that brings in the sort of slightly Asian feel to it, right down into the gloves. We then actually work very closely with the sword makers, and we give them the molds that we've made our line with so that they can then decorate their swords. It's really important that we work with them and stunts as we move forward to make it safe. And then we see him without his helmet. Sore point. And then just quickly to Joffrey's. When we're designing an armor, you do have to think of rank and then interpret into each area. So here we see Joffrey completely overly ornate and not a scratch on it. And then just moving aside slightly to Littlefinger, I wanted him to be of service and low-key, to appear subservient and slightly menacing. The tiny, precise details important. The colored line is to reveal another side as he walked. A tabard of service and a fine, delicate belt from which hang his tools of service, silver-sleeved notepad, a small dagger, etc. His self-styled sigil always prominent at his neck. Later, as he gains confidence, we see a sweep of silk indicating this. Here are just, again, I just want to illustrate the sort of width of image I look at. I mean, it can come from anywhere. Here it was a few images to inspire the decoration and ways of giving messages. Again, here, the embroidery and colors for Cersei. Here, looking at the weight of cloth and the way it makes people stand. And again here, the gilt edging, which I employed a lot actually in Cersei's costumes. And then I wanted to look at embroidery and the way we could tell stories. I found this beautiful Chinese embroidery in the V&A where they have a lot of examples. And then widened it to the imagery of birds and metal reference for her belts. And finally to Botticelli, I love the way that the plant life is actually created onto the fabric. And then completely left field, I actually look at flowers and the way they wrap and the colors and the sort of subtleties. And which actually began to inspire the idea of the kimono for her. These are really, really early drawings of Cersei when I was trying to combine the Baratheon gold and the Lannister red within, as you see here. I sort of experimented with rope armor and gold. I mean, when you're trying to find your way into a project, you actually try lots of different areas, lots of different ways, but finally you sort of find a way and we begin to see something which is a little bit more recognizable. Details, you're really as good as the craftspeople you employ. I developed a magical relationship with my team. I encourage them to experiment and we have a creative bond. Here we see Cersei's dresses cut on fine silk, beautifully embroidered, yet always lined in a metal gauze to signify her inner strength. We see more examples here on the green. My embroiderer just embroiders directly onto fabric. It's amazing to see her work. She almost embroiders as though she's drawing. It's so quick. I also use sometimes this dusky pink when Cersei is needing to appear more caring. The courtiers and the middle class follow Cersei's style. The townspeople have a more ethnic sense. I often use this wonderful book to research shapes. It's Tilka, and it just has every single ethnic cut you can imagine and drape. I pull different references for the mood of the streets, of the brothels. And then I go to a costume house in Spain this time to pull different colors to inspire the color range that I might need for King's Landing. And here we see an example again of illustration, how important it is that I work with a production designer. We've made this wonderful sort of example of how they dyed their fabrics and how they sold it. Just quickly going back to these again, some very early ideas about how the court would look. I mean, you can still see the hip panels and the belt shape, but actually the colors and everything moved on quite a lot. And this is the early townspeople, just trying to get the different characters and the different types of costume that would be right for them to work in. This is one of the key dresses of King's Landing. It's made out of 3 meters of silk. It's worn by handmaidens, prostitutes, and actually, Dany's first dress that we see her in Pentos, which her brother pulls off, is based on his memory of this dress when he was in King's Landing. It has a weight at the back, it can cover the shoulders. It's just so versatile, and we made hundreds of these and dyed them in different shades. And this is just a scene, really, from one of our early market scenes in King's Landing. And then I love this shot. This is the Marjorie effect, a wave of blue washing into town, changing court dress into the barging. And this just shows, I think, the importance of colour. I'm just going to quickly show about the Silent Sisters who tend to the dying and dead. I had this lovely little reference from Botticelli, which really helped to inform the costume. I wanted the stretched vellum screen to offer privacy to the dying patient being tended to, and also for the 7 pointed stars representing the 7 gods to be the last vision they see as they die. And now just a bit of fun. One of the cruelest scenes, I think, in Game of Thrones was the joust of little people at Joffrey's doomed wedding. When I read it, I just thought it was awful, but I couldn't wait to design it. So with these wonderful references, I came up with these little drawings. I loved Stannis riding Melisandre, Joffrey on his golden lion. I had Renly riding Loris, which actually Dave and Dan thought was appalling, but very funny. I started off in a clean version, and then I went really dirty. And then we had Rob, which proved very difficult because the head kept falling off as they were doing it, but that was Rob. And then finally we have the Greyjoy. So I think that's as much as I can tell you now, because I think there are questions and discussions. So anyway, I hope that was informative. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Isn't that amazing? Amazing. I told her she could take this show on the road, right?
It's hard to cram so much into such a short time.
I know, in
so
5 years and all those places. It's incredible. And how each individual has such a long arc, and it keeps changing. Brian, what are some questions that you have at the top of your
I'm sort of wrapped with ideas, actually, and I've been curious, since we have the Greyjoys behind us, and I know you have a sort of special soft spot in your heart for the Greyjoys.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about this fascination with the men of the Iron Islands, what is dead can never die, these things? What is it about them that sort of has drawn you in?
I just love the bleakness of their place, and we actually made all their costumes completely from scratch, and we even actually, I wanted it to sort of have a sense that it was covered in fish oil and grease. Again, I wanted this idea of smell. And we sort of studied and hand-stitched every single costume. And then we did the armor, and we always try a different way to show a sigil. And I wanted theirs to just be so it's actually put leather on, and then we slashed the sigil into the leather covering the armor. And there was one cape which they all wear, which I love the idea sometimes of making costumes with as little, it sounds really lazy, but with as little effort as possible in the cut. And it actually ended up just being a long oblong with a slash, and then you put your arms in like this, and it became a cape. So it actually looks great, but it's such a simple thing. And then, of course, we edged it, and then we aged it, and we stitched it, and we do all that. But the actual pattern is so simple. And then it can come up over the head, and there's something about them. I loved the feel, and that it just was so at one with the place.
And I have to ask, for the audience members who don't know what a sigil is, could you explain what a sigil is?
Well, it's a representation of the place. It's their symbol, I guess. So the Lannister, it's a lion. Riverrun, it's a fish. Starks is a wolf, a direwolf. So we'd have to try and think of different ways of showing it which are relevant to the area, really. There's no point having a gold direwolf because it would look stupid. So the gold lion looks quite good. So you have to think of them reflect where they are, I suppose.
And even beyond the animal sigils, we do have the beautiful roses for the Tyrells. And I know you had some really great fun designing some of those outfits. Can you talk to us a little bit about the various gowns that Marjorie sort of inhabits that are very much alive?
It was so funny because we first did Marjorie, one of her first ones with this sort of huge cone dress, which I went, oh, what's that? and the thought behind this was that she was very young and she wanted to be the queen. So she thought she wanted to be extravagant and look rather I mean, what her head was the queen. When she finally gets to King's Landing, she realizes the way to be queen is to be young and simple. It's the way that she can fight Cersei, because Cersei can do that, but she can't do that. So she sort of reverts to this sort of simplistic, pretty, young, delicate girl. And so then we had lovely sigils with the roses. We made lovely metal roses with twisted bra here, which would hold her almost nothing dresses together. And then later, obviously, with the crown when she gets married, I love the idea of the antlers and then the rose entwining up and smothering it. And with her dress, that was the idea too. And on the wedding dress, the thorns are metal and leather. Although they're supposed to look very beautiful, there's a sort of anger, and there's not an anger, there's an aggression in there, a determination, I suppose. So, yeah, hers are actually. I always wanted to look like you could take them off with one opening, and they could just fall off. I mean, happens quite a lot on Game of Thrones. But the more simple she became, the more ornate Cersei became. And then Marjorie's simplicity started to be copied by the young girls of the court, whereas the elder women actually carried on wearing Cersei's, which was even more cruel to Cersei. So you have these wonderful games, and that's why I love that shot when the blue, the clear, clean young blue is sweeping in. And that's why I love colour so much.
I think that's something you've talked a lot about, is the range of palettes, and you've used a lot of blue in various places in Westeros and Essos. So talk about the different blues maybe for a moment, and how the Stark blue is different from the Dothraki blue, for example.
Yeah, with the Dothraki, we realised we really needed a strong colour which was precious to them, so that they could use it for ceremonies. And again, we're always trying to, because Game of Thrones jumps around so much, and in the beginning especially, people couldn't sometimes work out where they were. It sounds so silly, but we had to make something really, we know we're there. And that's why I spoke earlier about silhouette. It's so important. So with the Dothraki, I wanted this really strong blue, and we looked into the indigo plant, and we found out that it grew in hot but humid conditions. And so where they are, it's hot, but I thought maybe there are some areas near streams or something that could be humid enough for the plant to grow sparingly. So and it's such a great colour with the other references. And so they could make it into a paste and paint it on their skin. And it's so different. The blue-grey of the Starks is such a warm, true colour I wanted. It's a sort of, I don't know, somehow colours speak to you and they sort of give that impression. So those two, and then you have the clear sort of almost fragile blue of Marjorie, which is plays again against it. And I forget that they're all blues. To me, they're three quite different colours, really, because they say three quite different things.
Well, I love this sort of, the way you talk about dress and color with this anthropologist eye, but also thinking psychologically and sociologically, weaving these very complex narratives, and I think revealing maybe secret messages to us or suggesting bits about the internal psychology of the characters. When so many of the characters die, as is wont to happen on Game of Thrones, do you ever have this sense of anxiety that you really liked designing costumes for these sort of now deceased individuals?
Yeah, I was really sad that Catelyn Stark didn't come back as the ghost as she does in the books. I really wanted to do her.
About this,
I
David
know,
and Dan.
it was heartbreaking. I know. I loved her. I thought she was a wonderful. I love her as an actress and as a person, but I thought she was so great. But then, you know, that's what makes Game of Thrones so good. You have to just move on, and it's and
you're very busy with so many costumes,
I'm quite
so you
busy,
can't labor
so it's quite good actually when some people die, because it means I have to get on to the others. I love the prostitute scenes. It's such an easy day for me.
Well, this is one of the questions we have, is this idea that you do also design these scenes of lack of clothing, and then the question of what's underneath some of these costumes. Do you think on the level of undergarments, and you've mentioned the hygiene level? I mean, what are they wearing underneath?
Or not.
Or not hygiene, right? Not hygiene.
Well, obviously we know some people are not wearing anything underneath. We tend to go down so far, but I mean, we tend to let the actors wear their own underpants. Well, actually, what do we provide them sometimes? If it's going to be a really bloody, dirty, horrible scene, of course, we'll provide them with the necessary. But we usually, I mean, we always do the drawstring shirts, and because in some ways it makes the costume sit differently. If you don't put anything underneath, it looks too thin. So for Cersei, she'll always have a corset and she'll always have a we usually have a padded petticoat. So we do the layering. I mean, it's important. And also it's important that sometimes when a costume opens, you just see another color, especially with Littlefinger. I love his dark, rather somber pieces. But when it moves, you see as he moves forward, he gets sort of brighter and rather ornate linings. And I just think it tells of another side. So I think it's important.
Michele, when you started the show with the pilot, did you anticipate any of this happening?
No, I was one of those mad things, I would really, really I read the pilot, and I really wanted to do it, And I remember getting the phone call. I had to wait 6 weeks to find out if I'd got it, which was horrendous. And I finally got it, and I was like, yes, shit, what am I going to do? And it was like, this moment of euphoria lasted about 5 seconds, and it was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And my favorite assistant was actually on another film. It was going to be filming in Belfast. I found out the budget, which was awful on the pilot, I have to say. Like, I can't do this. I actually finally got a really experienced supervisor to budget it for me so that they would believe that it wasn't. But it was very hand-to-mouth. Pilots often are. People don't want to spend that much on a pilot. We were also told that this would be the first episode of the series. But in actual fact, there were only 3 scenes taken from the pilot that actually appeared in the first episode of the series. So it was a great chance as a sketchbook to try out ideas. I mean, our Pentos in the pilot was actually much closer to the books. And I actually really liked these huge, great big wrapped headdresses, but Dave and Dan both thought they wanted it to be more gritty and more real. So it was a chance to experiment, I suppose, at that stage. And we lost 2 actors. There was a different Catelyn, there was a different Daenerys, and we lost other heads of departments. So the people who stayed were actually quite lucky. I was quite fortunate, obviously. Did enough right.
And can you talk a little bit about this relationship with, you say Dave and Dan,
Dave and Dan.
the evil twins?
Yeah, they
Dave
are,
and Dan.
actually.
So when you receive a screenplay for an episode, do you receive all of those episodes for the series at once? Can you take us through how you actually manage it?
You receive sort of an overview, just an outline of what will happen, because usually they're writing right up until we start filming, which is frustrating sometimes, because sometimes you might prepare for a scene that seems to be in the first episode, and you're halfway through maybe 30 or 40 dresses in, and that scene gets cut. You go, and so then you have to think, how can you have to try and move it around. So you get an outline, and then, which is usually very amusing, because they've always put funny little sides in it. They always put digs at poor Kit. It's really funny. And little things about me, like Michele thinks she's going to do hats in this scene, but she's not. So it's a very amusing document when it arrives, and I've just received the one for Series 7, so it's quite interesting. And then slowly, I guess in the next sort of month or 2, we'll get an outline, the first view of the scripts, and then we'll start breaking it down and trying to work out where our budget should be spent. I don't think we're going to any new places now, but I don't know. Do we need to create new armies? How many battles are there? Because the battles take up so much time and money, because we have to do so many duplicates. We also have to look and see how damaged the stock is from last year, because when you're filming in Belfast in rain for like weeks on end, shoes just rot.
And with the fur.
And and then we have drying rooms, but it's pretty grim, actually.
Right.
It really is. And we filmed two places at all times. So we film in Belfast and then in Spain or Croatia.
How does that work?
It's tough. I have a big
There's only
crew.
one of you.
I know, and you have to look and go, where should I best go? There's Dani in her throne room, and there's Percy here. Where do I go? And you just have to decide. Well, I speak again with David and Dan. Where would you like me to be most? Which one are you worried about? And then I have 2 assistant designers. One's a historian, one's a textile artist, and one just works on the menswear with me, and actually the textile artist works on the women's and the ethnic. So they tend to divide up and go into the 2 areas, but it's frustrating because the historian will not work on women's costumes. So he doesn't like fantasy, he doesn't like women's costumes, but he does a really good job on the menswear, so I have to let him go.
Well, I love this idea of having a historian involved on this fantasy piece. And but could you talk to us a little about your sort of into fantasy? Have you always had this love for fantasy? Was this just the great project to work on? Do you love Tolkien? That's what I'm really trying to say.
Yeah, I know I should. Well, It's so funny.
You don't have to,
You don't have
Michelle.
to.
I
You don't
didn't
have to.
know that I liked fantasy. I mean, I like control, and I love this idea of creating something from scratch. And I just actually worked on a period piece that I mentioned before, which was really interesting, and the referencing is all there, and of course you really delve into the referencing there. But you are in some ways restricted to some extent, and it was, I couldn't make anything up. I mean, it was.
Did you get to do
fun.
hats, though?
I did a lot of hats. The Queen loves hats.
She loves hats.
So it's fine. So yeah, I don't know. It's a funny thing about hats in Game of Thrones. I mean, I do like them.
Where does that love come from? And we don't see very many hats.
I just think they're so characterful. I mean, I understand that, maybe John, well, I don't know, but it's cold. If I'm cold, the first thing I put on is a hat.
Right.
I guess he's got lots of hair, though. So
He has a lot of hair now.
Yeah, you can't see the actors. So how many people exactly work in the costume department?
I guess when it's fully up and running at its peak, it's about 100.
And with armorers and cobblers.
Yeah, so I have maybe about 10, 12 people in the cutting room. I have about 7 or 8 in the armor department. I have about 10 in the breakdown department. And then we have supervisors, wardrobe mistresses, etc., and then embroiderers and all the sort of decorative pieces. And then we have the 2 trucks, which are run, the wardrobe is on each truck, and then they have 4 or 5 people working for them. And then we have the extras department, which is vast because obviously we have so many extras. The great thing there is that it's all around me. There's my office, and it's like 10 strides to any really different department.
It must look like a factory.
It is. When we first started, we were working in these awful porta cabins in this terrible place. I actually had this, I mean, it wasn't pretty, but this horrible stinky moat around my porta cabin. And I really used to complain about it so much. Like, this is not for the actors have to come here. And then one year, just as I was about to say something, I just got these plans thrown on my desk, and they were the plans for the new costume house they built us. And they've built this wonderful building with new offices and fitting rooms that all interconnects with the great workrooms. So, and it's there to also help the film industry in Belfast, which is really taking off. So it's an investment for them.
I thought what was fascinating was that you said that some scenes will be shot in the studio in Belfast, and then the character will walk out the door and
be in the same costume. I know. This is what's so important about the continuity sheets. I mean, we do sync on set now, but so one crew will be with the truck in Belfast, and Cersei, for instance, will be doing something in a room. She'll leave the room. That costume then gets taken. It gets sent to Croatia, for instance, to the other crew. They send through all the pictures of exactly how she wore it. Cersei will go over. Then we'll film her. It can actually be a month later, maybe, or it can be 2 days later, coming out of that room. So the continuity is so important. And so the notes that the girls write, they have to be so correct. And with the photographs. I mean, I think years ago, people used to sketch. It was all sketched, wasn't it, and written. And we're very lucky with technology now, but it's
incredible. How many locations do you go to? I mean, how many are used for a typical episode?
I think usually it's probably 3. I mean, we haven't been to Iceland for a while. I hope we get to go again. I love Iceland. It's so great.
What's shot in Iceland?
The wildlings often, and the whites, although we do quite a lot of that in Belfast as well. So it's Belfast. We've been Belfast and Spain recently. Then it's Belfast and Croatia. Sometimes we have been to Malta and Morocco. I love filming in Morocco.
And do you have a permanent costume shop in all 3 places? Or?
No, we build each time and we re-employ.
And do you acquire local products when you're there?
Yeah.
And work with local craftspeople?
Yeah, absolutely. We just send a small team and then we actually recruit there. In Spain, they were wonderful, actually. They're so clever.
We have our audience questions. Let's see if we can stump Michelle.
Not hard.
Okay. We can go through these really fast.
Before you do that,
Okay.
Just as a reminder, we're Twitter, #DesigningGoT, Instagram, Getty Museum, and we won't get to all of the questions tonight. If your question is unanswered, particularly if it's for Bryan, we will try to answer it and continue the conversation after this.
Okay, we're going to go through these really fast. What was your inspiration for designing the costumes for Quarth?
Gosh, I can't remember. It's such a long time ago. I know I want to... Actually, no, I do. I saw these beautiful gates, which were I think they were Persian. It was actually a beautiful golden gates, which inspired the pattern for the costumes. And I wanted it to be incredibly theatrical. I remember thinking, it's all a show. So all the costumes had these silk fronts with stitching and print on, and at the back it was just like a sacking, or just a sort of simple cotton fabric.
Wow.
So it was all for show. And then we made these lovely sort of metal belts, and that was my big story about. I made these beautiful, really beautiful gold metal hats, and as I put them on, David and Dan took them off. And I was so upset because they just looked so glorious.
Next question. What percentage, if any, of Game of Thrones costumes are pulled from costume houses?
In the beginning, on the first series, we pulled more, obviously, than we do now. We're pretty self-sufficient now. We do use Cornejo in Spain sometimes to make costumes for us and help us out, and those are buy to rent. So on the whole, we're self-sufficient now, but initially, of course, we did. But we just took pieces from everywhere and then recollated it into our own costumes.
Because you've accumulated so much
We have
stuff
so much stuff
over the past 5 years.
Can you add on to that? Just
go ahead.
you made a beautiful comment earlier about some of the things that George R. R. Martin writes about in terms of costume, these sort of boiled leather things that you find maybe a little bit bizarre. Are there any other of these moments in his writing that you have taken to and others maybe that you haven't?
Gosh, it's awful. I mean, when I first got the job, I read the books. But then when I started working on the series, it was so confusing to read the books and the series because they're going in different places. So I haven't looked at them recently. I remember actually, I always think, if David and Dan had said to me, we really wanted to be like the books, I would have done that as well. I mean, I'm hired, you know. I don't really, I mean, I work in the place I'm set. If they say they want it to be fantastical, it would have been fantastical. If they say they want it really urban and dirty and gritty, that's what I'll do. So I quite like to do something really fantastical. It would be so exciting.
And what you said before, and it's so true, every costume designer would bring something different to this show.
I swear, if any costume designer did the same research boards as myself, it would look completely different.
Yeah.
It would. And so it's always an interpretation. It's based on your life and what you know and what appeals to you. And so, yeah, and actually I've always been quite theatrical, so I'm surprised actually it's as gritty as it is. I would have probably actually gone more George R. R. Martin if I'd been left to my own devices.
Next question. Could you please expand on how you portrayed Daenerys as both a Targaryen and a Dothraki?
Well, I guess she took the blue, which was her memory of Drogo, but the embroidery and the quilting in her costumes signifies the dragon scale. So it's a combination. But actually, as we've moved forward now, the blue is really dissipating. She's sort of moving away from it, and she's going through this sort of stage at the moment where it's a sort of purity. But underneath all her dresses, even her really pure dresses, she always wears boots and trousers. There's always this element in Daenerys that if she needs to, she can run. She can run and she can escape. And I think it's really important to keep that sort of groundedness in her.
Especially with all that blonde hair.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have great footwear, shoewear that you enjoy designing?
I like Drogo's because it was based on the Afghani horsemen. And I loved it because they're so particular and they're absolutely made for riding, so that when they are walking, the gait is really strange. And I remember when I first put him in them, he was saying, I've got to walk in these. It's like, yes, but it's so interesting because I just love that sort of choreography of what costumes do to someone and how it makes them think and walk. So those were really good. And I really liked, one of my favorite guys was Pedro Pascal, who played what's his name, Oberyn, and he was so fantastic. And I made some great boots for him, and he took them on the first fitting. He just went, yes, and he just, I mean, his costumes were quite feminine, and he just wore them with such masculinity. He was just fantastic. One of my favorites.
So we were talking about, this is a question about your swords, about the swords and the design of the swords, and you told that story about fight choreography and how they give you. They always want to have clean swords.
I know. Sometimes we have had a run-in slightly, and it's not. I understand why they feel like, but sometimes we've spent like weeks breaking down this costume. This costume has been in battle for maybe 3 days or whatever, and it's covered in mud and filth. And then the armourer will come along and go, "There's a sword." And you go, it's new. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's like, it's a really beautiful sword, but it's new. Can we put some mud on it? Like, don't put the mud on the sword. It's like, so we have to negotiate. And it's not fair because they don't have a breakdown department, but I say, look, please bring it to us, otherwise we have to do this on set. So it's the case, as I say, with production design, you really have to work together. And again, with stunts, we have to, I mean, we might make the most lovely piece of armor, but they go, we can't fight in this, we can't do this. So we have to be very careful that we give the room and we actually make it work. It has to do the things it's meant to do.
And you know, what we haven't talked about tonight is hair and makeup.
Yeah.
So I'm not up, nobody asked that question yet, but what about hair and makeup? How do you knit the head and the body together?
Well, we've obviously become great friends over the years, the three of us, as Jane, Kevin, and myself. And so, actually, and now it's lovely because Kevin lends me wigs, so when I do my fitting, because sometimes with Alina, she's got like short black hair, and it's really hard to get the proportions.
Of course.
So when we do blood and body scene, sort of fight scenes, the makeup will do all the blood on the arms, but we do the blood on the costumes. We try to make it washable so that we can wash it out. When we're doing cuts, we try and work together, but sometimes they're in a different country. It's hard, and we have to make sure that the cuts are in the right place. When we first started, they said, we've done this great cut here. We went, have you seen the costume? No. Well, it's metal, so it has to move to here. So you really do need to work quite closely together, but we are stymied sometimes by being in different places. Kevin always pulls the hair forward, and I always push it back, and he pulls it forward. So, but we get on well.
This is a question about one of my favorite characters, Brienne.
I know.
All right. Well, it says Brienne is a non-archetype, and how did you approach the design for Brienne? Was it something special, or?
Well, actually, it's one time we did actually really refer to the books, I think. I wanted her to be almost more of a knight than anyone else. Her armor was really quite particular. And I wanted it to be masculine, but not so masculine that it overtook her personality. I want her to wear it and own it. I actually like the second armor much better than the first. My first armor, I used to make a lot of stuff in composite plastic, which I don't like. I like it to be metal. It's heavier, and it informs the way the actors move, I think. We do use plastic sometimes for fighting because it's so dangerous, but her second armor was actually made in metal, and it just shone, and it was so great. And she's such a strong character, and she does so much of her own stunt work. I mean, the fight with what's it called? The big fight.
The Hound.
The Hound. I mean, that was the most horrific, awful fight I've ever seen. Of course, they used to stunt for some, but to me, that was one of the hardest scenes ever to watch. It just was so brutal. I mean, the Red Wedding was hard, but that was really, really tough, I think.
Here's a question. What images helped inform the costumes of the Dothraki? How did you think of showing Daenerys' transformation again through the series?
That's sort of two questions.
The
The Dothraki, I guess I looked, again, I've already said Afghan horsemen, I think in their footwear. I looked at Native American Indians. I just looked at any sort of Bedouin tribe, really. I actually, the thing I really liked about the Dothraki were the men's trousers, because obviously they're quite active sexually. And I wanted this idea that they were trousers, and then there's a split at the front, and then the flap comes over, so they can just lift up the flap, get to it, and drop the flap down again. I thought that was so practical. And Dani, I mean, her arc is really interesting, from being bullied by her brother, and then going through, and obviously then making a way with the Dothraki, which was working, and I loved actually all those, we wove all those, her costumes ourselves, and we loved doing that. And then obviously when we first were in Carth, the only time she actually dresses as a woman, or takes on a woman's costume is in Carth when she first gets there, and almost instantly realizes her mistake and actually moves into the men's style of costume. So at that time, she's always influenced by wherever she's been, and then slowly she actually becomes marine. I mean, she's influenced by the slaves that she's represented with her slave necklace, and then I think only recently in the last series we've seen her sort of change costumes for different places. Before, she's always been on the run or moving, so it was always one sort of shape. But now that then when she became Marine, she actually had different costumes for different places. So if she was in the throne, it would be something, but then if she was in the bedchamber, it would be something else with the very revealing dress that she wore.
Do you repeat costumes for characters?
Repeat
them?
Make more than one?
No, I don't mean doubles. I mean, do you repeat them?
Yeah, do they wear the same thing twice?
Wear the same thing twice? Or?
Sometimes. I think if I want to show some reflection or some mood, yes, I will. I mean, Cersei really wears things. I try to move it along each season a little bit. But then I lie, because I think Arya had one costume for about 3 seasons.
Yes.
I love that. But to me, it was important because I wanted this sense of that she had stalled. If I changed costumes, there was no particular reason to change costumes. I wanted this just image while we saw this arc of Sansa and all that she went through. But you just kept coming back to this image of Arya, and everything was more important to Arya than what she was wearing. Whereas I think in Sansa, you could see the moment after Ned was killed. She's dressed in clothes which are like Cersei's, and she's in horror, and she just stays almost frozen in these sort of rather pale versions of Cersei's. And then eventually Joffrey rips one off of her, and then she marries Tyrion. Well, actually, no, before then, when she thinks she might have a chance with Loras, she starts sort of very slowly reverting back to her Stark look. You actually even see her wearing a fabric that was her mother's, but she can't go to blue, she goes to mauve, a halfway place. So you see her just sort of trying to inch back, but without taking notice. And then we see her marry Tyrion, and with the sort of lovely sort of girdle that Michele embroidered for me, with the sort of the story of her life, the fish and the wolf, and then the lion becoming involved, and then the stamp of the lion on the back, and then the wedding, we just see the wedding cape being put on her and drowning her in lions.
You know what, Michele? I think that you should do a commentary.
We do every year, actually. Deb is usually the production designer, and myself and the lovely Annette, who's a DOP. Every year we commentate over one episode for Blu-ray.
Do you?
And it's so funny because we have such a laugh.
Has anyone listened to that?
I've never listened to it. But
has anyone here listened to that? Because I was just thinking, instead of a director's commentary, because do you consciously send signals to the audience, send the audience messages mutely
Things
through
we should
costume?
look for.
It sounds like it.
I don't know if people notice, but I have to do it because it pleases me.
Well, because we're receiving all that information unconsciously, and we're never going to look at these episodes again
but
the same way.
But I also think in TV, people go back and re-look at things.
Yes.
And so the first time you watch something, you're watching to see what happens.
Yes.
But then I think it's really important that when you go back and look at another time, you go, oh, God, I didn't see this.
Yes.
I wonder if that means that. So, yes, subliminally, initially maybe, but later, I think you can go back and look, and I love the idea that you look into layers, and there's a reason, and I think that's really interesting.
Yes, well, you're providing it.
And you mentioned that you've sort of worn some of these. Are you sending messages even? Your necklace now sort of reminds me of Sansa's, her needle.
Well, I think this inspired Marine, actually. But actually, a friend of mine, a really dear friend of mine, gave me a lovely bracelet, which is really wide and silver. I love circles. And it's too heavy for my hand. And I was playing with it one day with fabric, and I thought, hang on, this could be so interesting. And I love the idea of the way people show wealth. And I thought these lovely gold discs tied on, and the more you have, the more wealthy you are. So I try and do, and like the women in Bravos, when they're young girls, they curl their hair. And then when they're married, they can let it down, and the man they marry can give them the gold that represents his trade to wear in his hair. So I try and always have a story and a reasoning behind everything.
It is a very complicated process. Since we all in our daily lives play the Game of Thrones in our own way, not literally, well, maybe. Do you have suggestions or or advice for how to dress for success in these ways, sort of to not lose one's head? I love this idea, the sort of subtle hint of color and the playing with fabrics and things. Any other kind of recommendations for how we can?
I think the striped socks.
Yeah.
I don't know, actually. I don't know. Don't quite understand.
I mean, I feel like you must look at people and think, well, that person's successful, that person's not, that one's going to fall off the wheel.
We all do that. I mean, we all express
So what's
things.
going to help us along in this sort of surviving in our own Westeros of today?
Well, I don't know. I can't answer. I don't know. I'll just stick to Game of Thrones, I think, not
All right.
to modern day times.
So this is the question that we've all been waiting for.
Is it?
What is your budget? You don't have to answer. But you did say something interesting about that your budget is, you're given the same budget every year.
The budget is the same every year, regardless of what we're filming. It's okay, but it's never enough. But then, I think it's quite interesting because I think sometimes if you're restricted, then it makes you more clever about what you're doing. And you can look at things and you can reuse things. I have made a mistake once or twice when I've reused principal costumes, in which has been appalling and I've had to remake them. But with extras, we can take the trousers from here, we can dye them a different color, and then they get really broken down so they can go there. So there are ways. I'm saying that, but who knows, this season might be a nightmare and I might have not
It won't
money.
be a nightmare. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to going back, actually. I was very sad to leave last year.
Michele, this says, how has hula hooping helped your design process? Do you hula hoop?
I do hula hoop. I love hula hooping. I sort of hula hoop in my room. And there's only one place in my whole workroom that I can do it because everywhere else I'd knock something off. So it's
Okay, Michele, how has hula hooping helped with your design
It
process?
keeps me fit for running backwards and forwards and getting all the extras ready.
Okay. And the next question is, which costume was the most difficult and the most challenging and why?
Gosh, it's hard. Things are challenging for different reasons. I think one that was quite challenging was to do the Unsullied. Because we work in so many different countries and people's shapes are so different, but we wanted to have a uniformity. So I sort of decided that we'd have to create the shape. So I went through quite a lot of processes. And I actually looked at sort of insects and everything, like with the exoskeleton, and trying to create a shape. So it took a long time to develop, but it was so successful ultimately because you can put almost anyone into that and it creates it. And it wraps on really simply. It's got this great sort of silhouette here. And then when we first did the pilot, I think in the book the spike comes out of the head, but it just looks so wrong and so clumsy. And then I found a helmet in the Stibbett Museum, I think, in Florence, which is one of my favorite places. And it just had this lovely line. I went, that's it. And it just looks so elegant. So it's true to the book in some ways, but it just looked more refined, I felt. So, I mean, I can name other costumes, but that, I think the armor and when it has to be for a group of people is quite difficult.
So this is the end of the evening. And now, will everyone join us outside for a reception? Could you please thank Michele Clapton for joining us tonight? Thank you. You did great.
That was wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.